How do societies truly navigate the treacherous waters of progress, manage vast wealth, and contend with the enduring, often unpredictable complexities of human nature? It's a question that has puzzled philosophers, economists, policymakers for centuries. But today, we're not just scratching the surface, we're diving deep into some truly profound answers, guided by one of history's most insightful thinkers. Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 04, Episode 18. Today, we open Will Durant's Fallen Leaves to confront one of history's most defining ideological clashes, the dynamic interplay and surprising convergence of capitalism and communism, and the welfare state born in between. Our mission today is, well, it's to extract the most profound, perhaps even unsettling insights from Durant's deeply personal reflections and his sharp historical analysis within Fallen Leaves.
We're not merely here to understand these monumental systems as, abstract theories. We're on a quest to uncover the fundamental, often stubborn forces of human nature that sculpt them, bending even the most rigid ideologies to their will.
This deep dive is about unpacking how seemingly opposing systems have, in fact, influence each other, leading to unexpected outcomes and, crucially, informing the very fabric of our present world. It's a journey into ideas and instincts that still shape our daily lives, often in ways we don't fully perceive.
And for such an ambitious journey, Will Durant is an exceptional, maybe even indispensable guide. He wasn't simply a prodigious historian painstakingly documenting the past. He was a profound observer of human nature, a philosopher who watched societal evolution unfold with a keen, often disarming honesty. Fallen Leaves, in particular, it offers this unique window into these complex ideological landscapes precisely because it's filtered through his own personal intellectual odyssey. He takes us through his own shifts in belief, showing us why he arrived at his conclusions. His insights aren't merely historical footnotes from some bygone era. They're deeply relevant, I think, to understanding the complexities and paradoxes of contemporary society. He brings this rare blend of scholarly rigor, philosophical depth, and personal candor to these topics, making the abstract feel remarkably human and accessible.
Okay, so let's begin where Durant himself begins Fallen Leaves, with a truly fascinating personal query, one that I suspect many of us have pondered, in our own lives or observed in others. Why do we as individuals tend to become more conservative as we age? It's a common observation, almost a cliche, right? But Durant really digs into the underlying, sometimes uncomfortable reasons. What's his primary argument here?
Well, he posits a primary cause that is remarkably grounded in, let's say, economic and existential reality. Durant suggests that this ideological shift is largely due to finding one's place within the existing system. When we're young, we're often unplaced, right? Still finding our footing, little to lose, much to gain, maybe from radical change. But as our incomes typically rise, as we accrue savings, as we invest in the established economy, maybe buying a home, starting a business, building a retirement fund.
Then suddenly big changes seem threatening.
Exactly. Any significant revolt, any truly radical societal upheaval could potentially lead to a substantial personal loss. Our economic security, in essence, becomes deeply intertwined with the stability of the status quo. This naturally, almost instinctively, aligns us more conservatively as our personal stake in the system grows. It's a profound insight. Our wallet often dictates our worldview more than pure intellectual conviction might suggest.
That's a compelling argument, almost a self-preservation mechanism, isn't it? But Durant doesn't stop there. He also introduces a secondary cause, one that conservatives themselves often emphasize.
Right, the growing knowledge of human nature.
Yeah. As we accumulate life experience, as we observe history, maybe even our own repeated failings, we start to recognize the inherent limits that human behavior places on achieving grand utopian ideals. The world and human beings within it, they just aren't always as malleable as our youthful idealism might wish. We learn that grand plans often stumble on, well, very human realities.
And to complete this picture, Durant even ventures into the physiological. He suggests there's a biological component too, a lessening of vital forces as we advance in years. Think about it. The boundless energy, the often fearless idealism, the sheer physical stamina of youth, which can fuel revolutionary fervor, it naturally diminishes with time. So, to you listening, does this resonate? Do you recognize these shifts in yourselves or in people around you as age progresses? These factors, economic entanglement, understanding human fallibility, even physical changes, they suggest, a kind of natural evolution in perspective, shaping one's view of societal change. It's key to understanding why some young radicals become cautious guardians later on.
And Durant doesn't just theorize about this shift. He actually uses his own extraordinary life story as a vivid illustration, doesn't he? How does his personal journey from radicalism illuminate this?
His journey is absolutely captivating. A perfect example. He starts by describing his early life. raised staunch Roman Catholic Republican family, small conservative town, North Adams, Massachusetts. Then, around 1905, age 19, he makes his swift, dramatic, and quite public leap into agnosticism and socialism. It wasn't gradual, it was a profound ideological flip, a complete rejection of his upbringing for these radical new ideas.
Quite a transformation. And he even details his time in a Catholic seminary around 1909. He admits pretty candidly that enrolling there was largely a delusion. He genuinely believed he could, as a priest, subtly influence the church towards socialist ideas. What does that tell us?
It says a lot about his early idealism, maybe youthful naivete too. Here's this young guy so committed to a socialist vision, so convinced of its moral rightness, that he thought he could reform an ancient institution like the Catholic Church from within. He believed in the power of ideas to transcend structures, seeing the church as a potential vehicle, not an obstacle. Shows this profound, if ultimately misplaced, faith and persuasion and boundless optimism for change.
And things get even more interesting in 1911. He leaves the seminary, dives headfirst into the intellectual ferment of New York City, becomes the sole teacher and chief pupil at the Ferrer Modern School. Now, this school itself is incredibly significant, named after Francisco Ferrer, a martyred Spanish rebel against church control, a real hotbed of radical thought. And the board members, what a mix.
Oh, an incredible crucible. You had Emma Goldman, whom Durant describes with a touch of dry wit as a doctrinaire and authoritarian apostle of liberty. I mean, that phrase alone
Tells you a lot, yeah.
Then Alexander Berkman, characterized as a sincere and lovable unionist, despite, trying to kill Henry Clay Frick back in '92. He was later deported to Soviet Russia, got totally disillusioned, and tragically died by suicide. Harry Kelly, a tireless devotee of anarchism, who interestingly blocked a Durant article because it leaned socialist, showing even rebels have their dogmas. And Leonard Abbott, a highly cultured philosophical anarchist, Durant called him the angel of the radical movement, one of the finest humans he knew. It must have been intense.
An intellectual pressure cooker. What did Durant take away from all these figures and experiences? You mentioned the instincts of rebels.
That was huge. His encounter with Harry Kelly especially revealed this profound truth, that rebels have the same instincts as other people without the caution that keeps others in line. It was a major aha moment, a realization that human nature, with its tendencies towards dogma, ego, factionalism, even violence, it stays remarkably consistent across the whole ideological spectrum. Even those fighting for radical change can show the same human flaws as the establishment they oppose, a powerful lesson in human consistency. He also learned from Goldman's magnetic but uncompromising style and Berkman's tragic disillusionment, seeing the personal cost of that zeal firsthand.
He stuck with his socialist sympathies for a while, though, until 1916, then another shift, working for Woodrow Wilson's re-election. This move, supporting a mainstream Democrat, caused a real stir in his radical circles.
Oh, absolutely. The Socialist Daily, the New York Call, branded him an apostate in this stinging editorial, "We Know This Breed." He mentions joining Amos Pinchot's Wilson Volunteers, giving street talks, while Walter Lippmann addressed big gatherings.
We know this breed. What was the gist of that, and what did it mean for Durant?
It was a scathing attack, basically accusing him of selling out, abandoning true radical principles for political expediency or personal gain. We know this breed implies he was just another intellectual flirt, ditching radicalism when it got inconvenient or mainstream chances appeared. This really highlights the intense personal cost of shifting beliefs when you're deep in a committed group. Durant's willingness to leave doctrinaire adherence despite the criticism and lost friendships speaks volumes about his intellectual honesty and evolving pragmatism. It's a lesson in that tension between flexibility and the rigid expectations of political movements. He was moving from pure idealism towards more pragmatic liberalism, seeing progress might need compromise, not just confrontation.
Now, despite that shift towards liberalism, his socialist sympathies weren't totally gone. They were actually rekindled quite powerfully by the Russian Revolution in 1917, though he admits supporting the Bolshevik cause, even from afar, cost him a lot of friends among New York's radicals and literati. Shows the intense divides back then. What pulled him back, and how did his view change later?
This is a really crucial point in his intellectual journey because he later admits he judged Russia foolishly back in 1932. He reflects that, despite being a master of history, his addiction to history, he failed to interpret the awful conditions he saw in light of the past. He recognized a profound oversight, a critical lack of historical empathy and context in his initial, perhaps too harsh assessment of the early Soviet Union.
So what historical context did he realize he'd missed or misjudged? What was missing from that earlier critical view?
He lists a staggering number of burdens Russia faced. First, centuries of brutal exploitation and crushing poverty under the czars, leaving people mostly illiterate, poor, used to autocratic rule. Then, just before the revolution, they'd fought and lost a devastating war, World War I, which shattered the national order, economy, social fabric. Plus, the new Soviet state, right after its birth, was plunged into a desperate civil war, fighting enemies and former allies on a dozen fronts from Germany to Japan. Imagine the sheer scale of that threat. And crucially, Durant realized that 15 years, to 1917 to 1932, just wasn't enough time to turn such chaos, agony, starvation into order and plenty. He admitted he failed to grasp the sheer impossibility of setting up a peaceful democracy given the economic disarray, general illiteracy, and the collapse of local and central government after the Tsar fell.
And this leads to Durant's most crucial insight, a profound, maybe chilling concept about the early Soviet Union. What was that core realization?
His core insight was this. Russia, from 1917 to 32, wasn't a nation of peace, gently developing ideals. It was instead a nation at war, surrounded and besieged, threatened with conquest and disintegration. In that dire situation, he concluded, it put democracy aside as a luxury, something it couldn't afford, and established a dictatorial regime as the sole alternative to disaster. This is the key takeaway. Communism in those early years essentially functioned as a war economy, a desperate measure for survival, and arguably its continued dictatorship depended partly on the persistent threat of war. It frames the Soviet experiment not as pure ideology, but brutal necessity forged in conflict.
And despite those immense challenges and the inherent brutality, Durant notes this merciless dictatorship went on to achieve startling things. In just 50 years, 1917 to the late 60s when he's writing, it transformed Russia from backward agrarian society to one of the strongest nations on earth. What were these accomplishments and the cost?
Absolutely. While fully acknowledging the devastating human costs, the famines, the revolts, the purges, the concentration camps, 1,000 policy mistakes, Durant also saw that the Russian government, through central planning and forced industrialization, did lift its people to a level of prosperity unknown to them in Tsarist days. He even speculated this level might have equaled Western Europe if Russia hadn't been forced to divert so much resource and manpower, intellectual and physical, to military buildup. It's a complex, brutal story of progress at an astronomical human cost, driven by that war economy mindset.
And that intense military focus, however tragically necessary, proved itself in World War II. Durant highlights Russia's extraordinary, almost unbelievable performance in 41, attacked by what he calls the strongest, best trained, best equipped, and best led army then in existence, Nazi Germany. Driven back to Stalingrad, suffering incredible losses, yet soldiers and people fought with heroic courage, grim perseverance, beat the invaders back across Russia through Eastern Europe all the way to Berlin, playing a decisive role.
And here he adds an important nuance. He clarifies that while American materials, Lend-Lease aid, industrial equipment, certainly made this recovery and victory possible, it was ultimately Russian flesh and blood that made it real. It gives a more balanced, stark perspective, reminding us context, sacrifice, and sheer human will are vital to understand. This whole segment is crucial for seeing how extreme circumstances can shape political systems, forcing dictatorial molds sometimes, and why historical context is essential for sound judgment, even for someone like Durant. You can't judge a war-torn nation by peacetime standards.
Okay, this sobering history of Russia's forced evolution makes it even more fascinating to turn to America's very different response both to communism's challenge and its own Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt, in what Durant calls the most brilliant statesmanship of the 20th century, devised the welfare state. What made this so brilliant in Durant's view?
It was brilliant because it wasn't just reactionary, nor a full embrace of a foreign ideology. It was this profound act of creative synthesis. Faced with the Depression suffering and the challenge from Soviet planning, Roosevelt didn't scrap capitalism. Instead, he ingeniously tempered its excesses, addressed its vulnerabilities, while keeping its core dynamism. He fundamentally reshaped the relationship between individual, state, and economy.
And it wasn't just FDR, was it? Durant points out this peaceful revolution carried on.
Exactly. Presidents Truman and Johnson, Durant says, carried it forward, each expanding its scope. Truman pushed for national health care, strengthened Social Security. Johnson's Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education, civil rights extended the welfare state massively, maybe only exceeded by Great Britain post-WWII. It shows this remarkable continuity, a kind of decades-long consensus reshaping the American social contract.
What's really fascinating here, maybe Durant's core insight for this period, is his observation that these democratic administrations did not enact socialism. Instead, they achieved what he calls a Hegelian synthesis of capitalism and socialism. This synthesis, he argues, was so effective that even lifelong socialists like Norman Thomas felt their efforts weren't in vain. That's powerful. What does Hegelian synthesis mean here, and how did it make socialists feel validated?
That term Hegelian synthesis is absolutely key, drawing from Hegel's philosophy. In this context, it's a dynamic process. You have a thesis, say, unchecked laissez-faire capitalism. It confronts its antithesis, the critiques and solutions offered by socialism or communism. Out of that clash, that tension, a new, higher synthesis emerges. It isn't a victory for one side. It incorporates valuable elements from both, transcending their original limits. For Norman Thomas and other socialists, the American welfare state wasn't pure socialism, obviously, but it adopted many core socialist goals. More economic equality, social safety nets, public services, state intervention to fix market failures. The government was actively trying to mitigate poverty, unemployment, lack of health care, central socialist concerns. So while capitalism's engine, private enterprise and profit remained, the results were being redirected, redistributed in ways aligning with socialist ideals of collective well-being. It felt like their decades of advocacy had finally borne fruit within a capitalist framework, achieved democratically.
And the architects of this weren't blind idealists. They were pragmatic. They recognized capitalism's virtues, didn't they? The creative stimulus from freedom and laissez-faire after 1789, how it unleashed invention, enterprise, production, appealing to those deep, acquisitive, and competitive instincts.
Oh, absolutely. They saw capitalism's unique power to generate wealth and spur innovation. It harnesses self-interest, the drive to compete, channeling it into productive economic activity. This freedom to create, invest, trade, it led to explosions of new tech, industries, goods. Think Industrial Revolution, huge corporations, capital accumulation, all driven by that creative stimulus. It tapped into fundamental human drives like no other system.
But they also immediately saw the profound, dangerous downsides of unchecked liberty. What were these flaws the welfare state aimed to fix?
They saw that natural inequality in economic ability, unrestrained, led inevitably to extreme concentration of wealth. Think of the Gilded Age, huge disparities. This wasn't just a moral issue, it created real economic instability. What's more, most of this concentrated wealth, they realized, got reinvested in accelerating production, more factories, more goods. Paradoxically, this caused periodic depressions dangerous to the survival of the system. That was the critical flaw. What good is multiplying production if the system collapses? Because most people can't afford to buy this stuff.
You can almost see those boom-bust cycles.
Exactly. Late 19th, early 20th century, massive, unregulated growth, wealth piling up at the top, then devastating crashes like the Panic of 1893 or the Great Depression itself. Millions jobless, hopeless, factories idle, goods unsold. The welfare state architects saw this cycle wasn't a side effect, it was inherent and destabilizing if capitalism was left totally alone.
So the solution they devised was, in Durant's view, ingenious. Basically, people surrender more profits and salaries to the government, redistribution, but with an economic purpose beyond charity.
Precisely. And this happened, Durant explains, through a rising rate of taxation. Instead of wealth staying mostly with a few who got it, these increased taxes let federal and local governments spread money in relief, pensions, social services, education, medical aid, hospital care, and public works. Think of the CCC during the Depression, putting millions to work on infrastructure or Social Security for the elderly and unemployed. These programs put capital directly into the broader population, stimulating demand, creating jobs, instead of letting it stagnate in huge, undertaxed private fortunes.
The impact was clear. Some of the concentrated wealth was distributed, which meant the purchasing power of the people came closer to their ever-expanding productive capacity. Crucial for keeping the engine running. Consumers became active participants. As Durant said, the system worked and spread abundance. Though he adds that cyclical note, this continued until wealth was again concentrated and necessitated another distribution. What does that cyclical nature imply?
It implies the welfare state, as Durant saw it, isn't a one-time fix, but an ongoing process, a continuous balancing act. It accepts capitalism's tendency to reconcentrate wealth due to unequal ability and the profit drive. So, periodic interventions, higher taxes, new social programs become needed to keep that balance between production and consumption, to prevent another collapse. It's a pragmatic acceptance of capitalism's nature, a sort of constant calibration.
And this is where socialism inserted itself into capitalism without destroying it really comes into focus. How did this radical shift keep capitalism's dynamism while fixing its flaws?
Year by year, government took and spread more wealth, managed or controlled more of the economy via public services and transfers. But crucially, it did so without destroying the underlying capitalist engine. Enterprise, competition, profit pursuit still had stimulating freedom. Great fortunes were still made, entrepreneurs still incentivized, a key point critics miss. But the fate of these fortunes changed. Some still squandered in luxury, revelry, or display. Durant cites $50,000 debutante parties, a vivid image. Others, to avoid taxes, became foundations, often helpful to education, science, medicine, religion, redirecting private wealth indirectly to public good. But the big systemic change was that the greater part of the new fortunes fell forfeit to the state through taxes for public welfare.
And he wraps this section noting this extension of welfare services. Added to automated production and rationalized distribution, reduced poverty to a point lower than any hitherto known to history, though still alarmingly real. A clear statement of its impact. This really sets the stage for his direct comparison of the two global systems.
Absolutely. It shows how America found its own path, distinct from both pure laissez-faire and pure communism.
So with the welfare state established in America, Durant frames the global situation. Now, the rival systems communism plus dictatorship versus capitalism plus the welfare state stand face-to-face in competition for the allegiance of mankind. A stark ideological standoff.
And Durant, always honest, quickly admits his own bias, crucial for credibility. He freely says he's born in the U.S., roots, friends there, and only in a democracy could he have had his opportunities for education, travel, uncensored writing. He specifically notes the freedom to analyze governments critically, including his own. While admitting some liberties were curtailed, even then he mentions not being able to visit communist China without his U.S. passport being withdrawn. He stresses much liberty remains, highlighting fundamental freedoms, right to strike, picket, criticize the government fundamentally without fear of jail. This personal connection grounds his analysis. He's not just an academic, he's a product of the system he's examining.
He then introduces this profound general principle about freedom itself, offering a chilling view on how societies react to external pressures. Internal freedom varies inversely with external danger, implying that as threats rise, liberties tend to fall.
And he immediately applies this to the U.S., arguing, liberty has diminished because airplanes and missiles have reduced the power of the oceans to protect us. Incredibly prescient, right? Given how geopolitics have changed. As improved communications and transport override frontiers, global supply chains, travel, internet, all major states get caught in a web of perils that erode liberty and make for compulsory order. Threats arrive faster from further away. He even makes a chilling prediction. In the next world war, all participating governments will be dictatorships, and all involved economics will be socialist. Not necessarily a moral judgment, but pragmatic. Extreme survival conditions might force even democracies to centralize power and resources massively, mirroring the systems they oppose. It's a thought-provoking, almost dystopian vision. For you listening, does this resonate today? Do external threats get used to tighten internal controls?
It's a powerful, unsettling thought. But Durant also argues this very rivalry between the systems actually helped reduce their individual drawbacks, like a constant pressure cooker forcing evolution and self-correction.
Precisely. Let's look at capitalism's flaws, which Durant lists clearly. First, that periodic imbalance between production and consumption, the boom-bust cycle. Then, dishonesty in advertising, labeling, and trade, the constant fight against deception for profit. Also, efforts of large corporations to crush competition, the struggle against monopolies, then pervasive involuntary unemployment due to the replacement of labor by machinery, automation displacing workers. Finally, maybe most viscerally, abnormally swollen fortunes generating resentment in the enclaves of poverty, deep structural issues that could destabilize society if unaddressed.
And communism, he argues, has its own distinct flaws hindering efficiency and responsiveness. What were those fundamental challenges Durant saw?
Communism faces the huge difficulty of substituting governmental prevision for the capitalist way of letting public demand determine what shall be produced. How do you centrally plan for millions of individual desires, often led to shortages, queues, unwanted goods, then restraints on competition, which stifle innovation and quality? No rival product, less incentive to improve yours, and a consistent challenge. Inadequate incentives to invention, plus reluctance to use the profit motive. If everyone's paid roughly the same, what drives exceptional performance or invention often resulted in stagnation, inefficiency, lack of choice.
This is the nuance. The rival system's existence forces each to face its weaknesses, a dynamic interplay. How did this competition push adaptation?
Capitalism, facing communism's challenge of equality and stability and seeing its own depressions, was compelled to embrace the welfare state, had to mitigate boom-bust, redistribute wealth to keep social cohesion, economic viability. If not, communism's appeal might have grown irresistible. Conversely, communism, facing capitalism's dynamism, consumer abundance, tech innovation, had to start making concessions to individual incentives. We saw the Soviets use market mechanisms, later China's dramatic reforms, embracing significant capitalist elements to drive growth. It's a fascinating dynamic. Competition, even ideological, can lead to adaptation and self-improvement, pushing both systems toward pragmatic evolution, often contradicting their pure ideologies.
This brings us to a truly core idea from Durant about the unseen, powerful force of human nature itself. He posits that human nature, as now constituted, seems to favor a system of relatively free enterprise.
Provocative. Why does he say that?
He focuses on the acquisitive instinct, that fundamental, almost primal desire for food, goods, and powers. Durant notes, never in historic times was that impulse so unchecked as under capitalism. It's not just greed, it's a deep drive for security, comfort, status, control over one's environment. Capitalism, with private property, individual enterprise, profit pursuit, provides a powerful, almost limitless outlet for this drive. It lets individuals directly benefit from their labor, ingenuity, risk-taking, tapping a potent motivation other systems struggle with.
And while the itch for profit may not be overwhelming in the common man, most might just want comfort, not vast fortune. Durant notes it is strong in men who are above the average in economic ability. And crucially, he believes it is this half of the nation that will sooner or later mold the economy and the laws, implying the drive of a certain segment disproportionately shapes society.
It's pragmatic, maybe cynical. Durant suggests even if the average person is content, the most economically capable entrepreneurs, innovators, risk-takers, those with the strongest acquisitive instinct, will inevitably rise to influence. Their drive to accumulate wealth and power becomes a major force shaping economic policy, laws. They create industries, accumulate capital, lobby for favorable laws. They're engines of growth, but unchecked, also engines of wealth concentration. Their inherent nature in a free system becomes dominant.
And here's the surprising link to communism, ostensibly designed to suppress this instinct. We can understand then why communism had to make increasing concessions to this instinct. This really challenges the common view. How did communist systems adapt?
It's a profound observation about ideology's limits against human drives. Initially, communist systems tried total collectivization, eliminating private property and profit motive. But Durant points out this often led to stagnation, low innovation, low productivity. People just weren't as motivated for an abstract collective goal as for direct personal benefit. We saw it in the USSR and China. Despite ideology, concessions were made. Collective farms often allowed small private plots, and these tiny plots, harnessing the acquisitive instinct, often produced a disproportionate share of food. Later reforms, especially in China under Deng Xiaoping, explicitly embraced market mechanisms and profit incentives, recognizing that without appealing to this fundamental drive, their economies couldn't compete or provide effectively. A powerful testament to the acquisitive instinct's endurance, forcing even planned systems to compromise.
Beyond acquisition, Durant brings in other powerful instincts. He mentions the urge to sexual union and play as only slightly less powerful. Interesting how different systems manage that.
Indeed. He observes this impulse has obviously more freedom in America and Western Europe than in communist countries, which, he says, struggle to preserve the Puritan code associated with their agricultural past. This isn't just casual cultural observation. It speaks to deeper structures. Western societies, influenced by Enlightenment liberty ideals, tended to gradually liberalize views on personal expression, including sexuality, seeing it as private or individual freedom. Communist regimes, especially early on, often inherited or enforced more traditional puritanical codes, seeing sexual expression as distraction from collective goals, bourgeois decadence, or destabilizing. Highlights how even basic biological drives get shaped differently under different ideologies.
And then the third instinct, the impulse to fight and to compete. This, he argues, has enjoyed a heady release under capitalism. This competitive drive, like the acquisitive one, seems to thrive in free enterprise. How does it manifest, and what are the benefits?
Durant sees competition as a powerful engine for improvement under capitalism. He uses a tangible example. What would Ford and General Motors cars be without their constant rivalry? He points out how this relentless competition in design, engineering, marketing, price improves industrial products. Think about it. If Ford made the only car, why innovate? But with GM constantly trying to outdo them, and vice versa, both are pushed to build better, safer, more efficient, appealing vehicles. Despite secret and illegal agreements or monopoly attempts, he contends every product in America is subject to such stimulating rivalry. This constant pressure, even if messy, ultimately drives innovation, efficiency, consumer benefit, harnessing that innate impulse to compete.
Durant then poses a critical question about how this instinct is managed or stifled in communist systems. I wonder whether state control of production would allow sufficient competition to realize similar benefits to the consumer. Can central planning substitute for market pressure?
And he follows up by probing Russia's rapid progress before 1960. How much was due to internal competitive dynamism, and how much to free imitation of foreign inventions and processes, themselves the result of free enterprise and competition, and to the importation of foreign machinery and technicians? A crucial, often overlooked point. Durant suggests Soviet gains weren't mainly from internal competitive innovation, but from adopting reverse engineering tech developed in the capitalist West. They learned from capitalist competition without fostering it internally, highlights capitalism's potential to indirectly benefit rivals by driving innovation they can adopt, underscores global interconnectedness, a powerful argument for free enterprise's inherent innovative power.
Then there's another powerful human instinct Durant identifies. One he suggests actually favors the communist system, the instinct of aggregation. He notes, most men are content and many are pleased to follow a leader or join a crowd, tapping into the need for belonging, collective identity.
Absolutely. This instinct for aggregation, collective action, identity, being part of something bigger is powerfully leveraged by communist systems. They emphasize national unity, collective sacrifice, loyalty to party leader, channeling individual desires into unified effort. Propaganda, mass rallies, state organizations all reinforce this collective purpose. For many, this provides security, meaning power potentially absent in a purely individualistic society.
And he contrasts this poignantly with America. We have crowds in America too, but they are hiding places for lonely individuals rather than cooperating groups animated by collective actions, pride, and ideals. A fascinating, almost melancholic cultural observation. What do you mean by hiding places for lonely individuals?
It's a striking contrast. In America, he suggests, crowds at sports, concerts, even rallies are often ephemeral gatherings where individuals keep distinct identities, maybe even seeking anonymity in the mass, not necessarily deeply integrated cooperating groups driven by a profound, shared, enduring collective ideal, like Durant sees in communist societies. In a highly individualistic culture, even collective experiences can be refuge for personal isolation, temporary escape from individual pressures, not expression of deep communal purpose, a poignant observation on potential psychological costs of hyper-individualism.
And he concludes this with a general observation about national mood, noting, the average American seems happier, laughs more, ventures more gaily, sins more freely than his communist analog. A broad generalization, but it invites reflection on how individual and collective instincts shape perceived well-being and national emotional tenor. What's beneath that?
It's fascinating, subjective, but illustrative. Durant isn't saying Americans are objectively better off, but the expression of well-being, social dynamics are different. Laughs more, ventures more gaily, could reflect cultural freedom to express joy, pursue leisure, experiment without rigid oversight. Sins more freely perhaps speaks to a more relaxed moral code, less state-imposed puritanism, greater allowance for individual choices deemed transgressive elsewhere. The communist analog, under constant pressure, might exhibit a more somber, disciplined, cautious demeanor. Forces us to consider how deeply political systems shape not just economics, but the very emotional and social texture of daily life.
This brings us to Durant's ultimate, deeply provocative thesis about the future. He wonders if we're witnessing a fundamental convergence, he asks. Will the cry for personal, political, economic, religious, and intellectual freedom become more insistent in communist countries, while simultaneously in the West, such freedoms will decline as private property? Are both systems evolving towards a midpoint?
He then expands on this, suggesting individualistic capitalism might transition towards state capitalism or government-controlled industry. a vision where lines blur significantly. Western governments might exert increasing control over key industries, maybe not through nationalization, but regulation, subsidies, partnerships, moving towards more centralized economic management due to global challenges or internal pressures.
He sees 100 signs pointing to this inevitability, this gravitation towards basic similarity, believes the nature of man, the danger and compulsions of conflict, and growth of communication and trade will all eventually bring the competing economies toward basic similarity. What are some signs? How do these forces drive convergence?
These forces are powerful. The nature of man dictates systems must eventually accommodate instincts like acquisition, competition, pushing even communist economies towards market mechanisms. The danger and compulsions of conflict, especially global war threat or intense competition, forces all states to prioritize national security, leading to centralized planning, state control over strategic industries, resource diversion to defense, blurring economic models, and growth of communication and trade creates an interdependent global economy. As nations trade, share tech, integrate supply chains, they naturally adopt similar operational efficiencies, regulatory frameworks, regardless of internal politics. A state-owned Chinese enterprise might still operate globally using market principles. These are the powerful forces Durant sees pushing disparate systems towards functional resemblance.
And here's where Durant injects that crucial, almost cynical observation. Meanwhile, the diminishing difference can be emphasized by the rival governments to generate the hatreds useful in nationalistic wars. A truly profound, unsettling insight. What does it say about conflict persisting even when systems become more alike?
This is maybe Durant's most chilling geopolitical insight. He suggests, even as practical realities of managing large industrial states force them into similar molds, the political incentive for division doesn't vanish. Rather, governments seeking to rally populations, maintain power, pursue strategic advantage might deliberately magnify perceived differences, turning minor distinctions into existential threats. They manipulate these diminishing differences to generate fear and animosity for nationalistic wars. Makes you wonder how much modern ideological conflict is truly about fundamental differences versus manufactured narratives for geopolitical ends. A powerful reminder that even if systems converge functionally, the human element of leadership and power desire can still drive conflict.
Let's delve into that. Durant argues that beneath the labels, the communist and capitalist systems already resemble each other in many basic ways. A claim that might surprise many, but he builds a strong case.
He points out striking resemblances. First, both systems have subordinated their internal economy to the needs of actual or potential war. Soviet command economy geared for military, or the U.S. military-industrial complex, huge resources diverted to defense, regardless of ideology. Second, both aim for world hegemony, though disguised differently. One with wars of liberation, communist expansionism, the other pleading it must be the policeman or order in a dangerously chaotic world, Western interventionism. Both project power globally, and most fundamentally, both can be described as a form of capitalism if we define this as a system controlled by the managers of capital.
He really drives that managers of capital point home. Explains that in America, some part of the worker's product is kept by private managers to provide private capital for private industry, traditional capitalism. But in communist countries, part of the worker's product is kept by public managers, actually by the Communist Party, to provide public capital for public industry. Managers change private capitalists to state bureaucrats, but the fundamental act of capital accumulation, setting aside production for investment, and its centralized direction remains.
The key difference, he notes, is the worker's role and individual freedom. The American worker, free to organize unions, to strike, to radically criticize his masters, to peacefully overthrow a party, and to vote himself. Governmental services, pensions, and relief plays a larger role in determining how much of his product comes back to him than does his communist counterpart. This is where the practical distinction, despite underlying structural similarities in capital management, becomes stark. The American worker has more agency, more channels for redress, more direct influence over wealth distribution via democratic means, even if the core mechanism of capital accumulation stays.
And he beautifully encapsulates this shared reality, stripping away labels, revealing a fundamental truth about power in large organizations, regardless of political banner, with this powerful summary. In both systems, the men who can manage men manage the men who can manage only things. That's the core nugget right there.
It's profound because it highlights the enduring human hierarchy in any complex system. Capitalist or communist, military or civilian, large organizations need people who can lead, coordinate, motivate, make strategic decisions involving others. These managers of men are the true power brokers,
whether in suits or party uniforms. Below them are those who manage resources, production, tech, the managers of things. Durant argues that despite rhetoric, the fundamental structure of human power is remarkably consistent, centered on those who can command human behavior. A sobering reminder that power dynamics often transcend specific economic models.
So we've journeyed through Will Durant's Fallen Leaves, exploring his personal intellectual evolution from youthful radicalism to pragmatic liberalism, shaped by observing human nature and reassessing the Russian experiment. We've seen how America forged a unique Hegelian synthesis in the welfare state, blending capitalism's dynamism with social redistribution to address its flaws and stabilize its economy. And finally, we've examined his compelling argument that despite overt differences, capitalism and communism, driven by universal human instincts and geopolitical pressures, are perhaps converging towards basic similarity, especially in management and state service, emphasizing the power of those who manage men.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought. If both systems are, as Durant suggests, bending towards similar operational realities shaped by human instincts and state survival demands, even while claiming distinction, what does this imply for the future? Are we truly moving towards functional similarity where practicalities override ideology? Or will the hatred's useful and nationalistic wars, as Durant chillingly put it, always find ways to keep them distinct and in conflict despite diminishing differences? It's a question that invites us to look beyond headlines, consider the deeper currents of history and human behavior shaping our world.
We encourage you to carry Durant's profound framework with you as you observe current events and economic shifts, reflect on your own perspectives on these timeless debates, and perhaps find your own answers about human nature and societal evolution. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.